Welcome, everyone, to the third event in the Sociological Review Foundation's Conversation series, where we're exploring why sociological ideas matter for understanding our world. It's part of our agenda to provide a space where we can question taken for granted ideas about the social world, but also make a space for alternative imaginations and possibilities. My name's Les Back. I'm a trustee of the foundation, and today we're reflecting on some big questions about how we work with and write about political activism, and specifically anti-racist activists. And I feel this is a real privilege for me and an honor because, being involved in these conversations, it's linked to my own story, my own pathway really into the world of sociology, because I learned so much as a white kid in South London in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s, from engaging in the spaces of learning that were literally across the street, in the record shops, community groups and centres, youth clubs, supplementary schools, book fairs, and even political demonstrations. There was an alternative curriculum available in those spaces. And those stories weren't in the university library, even though they were on the same streets very often, particularly in my case in New Cross, where I studied but also lived. And at that moment, there was a kind of, it seems to me, amidst the violence and the brutality of institutionalized racism by the police and other aspects of British society, there was a kind of political renaissance going on within the local black community at the time too. So the questions that we want to pose this afternoon is, how do we address or reckon with the gaps that exist between the archives when researching anti-racist activism? How can we represent the networks that produce this kind of precious knowledge really in the movements, and also celebrating individuals within that? And what's at stake in a kind of broader mission of knowledge and education, and not to think narrowly in the academic sphere in extractive ways in relation to communities, and the quite dreary language these days, it seems to me, of output and impact. And we're asking these questions in part because this event also follows the recent release of a wonderful mini-series of audio essays, what a brilliant thing in itself, called Sideways Sociology, UK Anti-Racism. And what we can learn in terms of an engagement with this history, and the essays are formulated around the profile of three key individuals and authored by three essayists, all of which are with us today. I'm very glad and happy to say. And what we can learn from this, both in terms of a broader and a richer sense of what it means to think sociologically. So, with that in mind, and mindful of wanting to stop talking and start listening, I want to introduce those three essayists who have joined me today. Firstly, John Narayan, who's Senior Lecturer at King's College London and also Chair of the Historic Institute of Race Relations. Hannah Ishmael, also at King's, where she lectures in race and digital cultures. And last but not least, A.S. Francis, author of the book Gerlin Bean, Mother of the Movement, and also completing a PhD and currently working for Tate Modern. So please, warm welcome to you all. But before we hear from our guests, I just want to make a few small technical things. We're using a rolling Q&A rather than the chat function. So everyone, do put your questions in the Q&A as you wish, and we'll monitor these and try and integrate them into the discussion. And we'll put a link to our event feedback form in our chat. We are listening. We're trying to respond to the needs of our audience. So it's really helpful for us to get that feedback and to continue to improve and help us both fund these events and develop a future agenda. Okay, so John, Hannah and Amelia, let me first ask you to say a little bit briefly about the people profiled in the essays and perhaps why you why you chose them, and why you want to draw attention to them, and perhaps encourage our participants here today to listen to them. So, John, you focused on Ambalavaner Sivanandan, known to Siva amongst those who worked alongside him and inspired by him, who's relatively well known, an extraordinary life and person. How would you describe him, John?
I think the best term I would use is legendary in it. But I mean, the term I've used in my work is that Siva is in some ways the kind of consciousness of British anti-racism. He's the kind of voice that pushes us a certain way to think a certain way. Just to give people a background, Siva was born in Ceylon, at the, just at the kind of turning of the 20th century, and then turns up in Britain out of one kind of context of anti-colonialism into, as he says, he walks into the Notting Hill race riots in 1958. So that kind of gives you a background, and then he joins the Institute of Race Relations, which at that time is a a kind of very conservative organization, and him and the fellow workers and a bunch of activists essentially decolonize that institute and turn it into this. So part of the reason we focus on him, as you said, he's quite well known, but in the essay, what I think we wanted to do with that was kind of retrieve, specifically for the anti-racist community, the kind of ideas of the links between anti-racism and economics and tech. And that's the kind of bit that maybe we don't focus on too much, which puts him at the center of current debates that we're
So
living through right now.
So much so, John. I mean, you used you get us to think through the mobile phone. How does the mobile phone provide clues into the way in which the globalized economy is working? Maybe we can come back to that later. But Hannah, your piece is about Len Garrison, the educationalist, activist, and key figure in setting up the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton, somewhere close to my heart, and somebody I listened to and learned from actually. But could you tell us a little bit about introducing Len and why he was a real polymath, wasn't he, and why he's relevant, particularly
Hi.
now?
Thank you. So yes, I never met Len Garrison. So all of my kind of thinking about Len Garrison is coming through his writing and through talking to other people. So I never, had the opportunity to actually meet him. But in terms of a little bit of context, my previous professional background was as an archivist. So I started working at the Black Cultural Archives many years ago as an assistant archivist. And as I was working there, I became very interested in why this institution had started. And Len Garrison was one of the kind of main drivers for that. So he was born in Jamaica in the 1940s, and he came over as one of those kind of children of the Windrush. So most of his education experience was undertaken here in Britain. So he was kind of at the forefront of some of the work of that we kind of find out about through Bernard Cord's work around kind of institutional racism and what was then known as educationally subnormal schooling, which is now a very obviously pejorative term. So I kind of was really fascinated by his kind of ceaseless energy around kind of drawing the kind of focus on education with the kind of focus on archive. So he was never a formal teacher, but he was always interested in education. So he was a trained photographer by background, which I think kind of speaks to some of his interest in representation. And so, yeah, he spent his life uh, doing his kind of work as a photographer, but then setting up institutions wherever he went. So he was based in South London for a while, and then went to Nottingham, did some work in Nottingham, and then came back to Brixton. So everywhere he went, he kind of took his kind of passion and interests around education and heritage and culture, and started kind of building networks and institutions with many other people as he went along. So I was just kind of really fascinated and inspired by his kind of energy and work towards this.
And there's a lot. It's really listening to the audio essays. There's so much about what education is, and the kind of model of education that these lives, in fact, embodied. And I hope we'll be able to come back to that. But with that in mind, Amelia, I wonder if I could come to you last but not least, and the extraordinary figure in life of Gerlin Bean, who passed away this year, I think, didn't she, in Jamaica?
Yeah.
Key figure in the emergence of black kind of black British feminist socialism, and also the thing that really struck me in your account of of Gerlin's life was her capacity to listen, a kind of radical listener. I wonder if you could just introduce her for us.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so Gerlin was an incredible figure, had touched so many people's lives. She was born in Jamaica in the 1930s and came over to Britain originally as a nurse, a student nurse. So she was recruited into the NHS, a common experience for many Caribbean and African women at that time. And when she got to Britain, which is like the late 1950s, she was immediately struck by British racism and all of its inner workings, but in the context of being a nurse and interacting with patients and also the senior staff. And so that kind of began a process for her of moving away from the healthcare system into community activism, but with a particular focus on youth advocacy. And she became, as you mentioned, really one of the key architects of what became a very distinct Black British feminism that was oriented around socialism and informed by kind of Marxist politics as well. So I came to know her through researching Black Power groups in Britain in the 70s and 80s. And she was a name that people kept referring to as a mentor, someone who's, taught them a particular life lesson. For younger people, someone that they looked up to and really informed their own ways of thinking around practical activism. So I think, yeah, because of that reason, I was like, we need to focus a book on Gerlin that's not only speaking to her and her own development as an activist, but also because she traversed so many different movements and groups and areas as well. Her looking at her life can tell us a lot about that particular moment in time and also the stories of many others as well. So it was a very useful exercise for that reason.
And you interviewed her too, didn't you?
Kind of. I mean, so I was pretty much harassing her for like 7 years before I could get her to sit down with me, because she was in the mountains in Jamaica with very bad Wi-Fi. And I actually met her at the Black Culture Archives Central Space back when it had its cafe. And I went with the intention of interviewing her and this prior agreement that that's what it would be. But actually, she really just kind of wanted to grill me about who I was and why I kept bothering her. So it was an informal interview. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, one of the the themes that I think all of your essays share or question around them is these are all movement intellectuals, and the sort of the the balance between the collective endeavor and the shared practice that I think you signal very well in your and also the individual voice, you know. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that. I mean, do you think, Amelia, that Gerlin would have been comfortable being singled out in quite this way?
It's a good question. Well, when we had this chat at the Black Culture Archives, she, I think, just being in the elder stages of life, was very aware that a lot of her peers had been by that point well documented.
Yeah.
Some of them have, written their own stories or recorded their own stories, or those who passed before her had their stories documented, and they had a much stronger archival presence than she did as an individual. And that's something that she was very aware of. So when I spoke to her, she was very keen to have a project that focused on her life, but with the intention that it's not important from an ego perspective, but it's because it does tell us so much about all of these different groups and how they were all interlinked in some way just by having this one figure who can demonstrate that for us. So I think, maybe in her younger life, it wasn't something that she was so interested in, but certainly as she got older.
Yeah. And that's such an interesting balance, isn't it? Because it's always often occurred to me that, you know, on the one hand, the kind of work that these lives animate is acknowledged individually, but can't be done alone. And I think in a way, all knowledge is like that. I don't know if you think that's right or.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Uh, Hannah, I wonder if I could just ask you about Len Garrison, who I know is a person, was a very humble person. How has he been sort of remembered? And I think I just want to ask you how adequate that is, and you know what was the kind of inspiration to in a sense give us different portrait of his life and work.
Yes, thank you. So Len Garrison, I think, occupies a slightly interesting space in how he is remembered. And I think to kind of the question about collectivity is always really important, at least for me, when talking about the Black Cultural Archives, is to recognize Len's kind of presence throughout most of its history, but also to recognize that he not alone, you know, was responsible for founding the organization and the other organizations he was involved in. So it was very much a kind of a communal and community effort. But as Amelia was saying, sometimes the way that sometimes just being around for a really long time and having a particular vision and the kind of documentary presence that kind of allows people to write about other people is kind of key to also why Garrison, I think, both can be written about and also has kind of issues about, you know, why people don't write about him very much. So basically, I don't know if I've ever answered the question, but in terms of how he's remembered very well, particularly by the Black Cultural Archives and kind of within the immediate community. But again, that kind of does sit in a little bit of tension with kind of not wanting to overwrite other people's involvement, and that becomes really hard as kind of Amelia was talking about. How do you kind of navigate wanting to recognize kind of individual work and what people have done, but without leading to, again, this kind of bottleneck where only one person can ever be spoken about, the kind of great men of history. And
Yeah, no, sure.
so yeah, I mean, it's very complicated. So yes, well remembered, but also not that well remembered, and it kind of then speaks to some other kind of tensions around, particularly around community work and where focus lays. Sometimes there is the kind of sense that one person is enough to talk about, and then how do you then bring up other people within these conversations as well.
One of the things that your audio essay made me think about is why education was such a kind of important field of political contestation in that moment, because it was this place where stigmatization and sort of brutal forms of racism were being imposed through education, you know, which was supposed to be the space of opportunity.
Yes, so my interest in that comes from, as I said, from the kind of archival perspective. And so one of the things I was really interested in is not only the focus of Garrison and others on education itself and the kind of process of education, but also that more, as he kind of talks about, that more kind of psychological, what we might now think about as a kind of reparative issues around education. So if you are not if you're not visible in education, if you're not visible in the curriculum, what does that lead you as a person to think and feel about yourself? So this is one of the reasons why I'm interested in why his work kind of it matters so much, is that it's not just fighting how people are educated or, you know, the kind of structural racism that exists in the kind of day-to-day processes of education, but also what actually the kind of underpinning of that, which is that if you, the kind of Eurocentric whiteness of the system, which completely dehumanizes huge swathes of our society. And that, I think, is a kind of one of the key things that I was really and am really interested in. Also kind of the kind of foresight and the ongoing commitment to that as an idea is something which I think is really important as well.
Yeah. So the archive, knowledge itself becomes
Basically, yeah.
a place
Basically, yeah, knowledge itself and how that is the kind of spring from which we can deal with some of these other issues as well. So his kind of activism was, I mean, it was engaged in resources and processes, but also the kind of intellectual work of how do you then just disrupt all of these knowledge systems too.
Yeah. John, I wonder if I could come back to you as well to address some of these themes, because in a sense, Siva, amongst the three activists we're talking about, possibly the best known, arguably the best known, and I wondered. I mean, I go back to this in preparing for today. I was reminded of that famous passage of Raymond Williams in the Long Revolution, where he says tradition is always about a process of selection, a continual selection and reselection of ancestors, and I just wondered if what your thoughts were about Siva's life and the various kinds of things that he did.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting way to think about when you say we might think, well, someone's more well known, but then I would flip it out. What are they known for, and who are they known by? Because there are different knowers, right?
Yeah.
There are different communities and retrievals that happen all the time. So, there's one version of Siva that fluctuates, say British sociology, but then there's the other Siva that I meet in my institute role, where it's activists who had a laminated copy of From Resistance to Rebellion that they bought, in an organizing house for 50p or something, 20p, something like that. And they read it, back to front 20 times. And so there are different ways of canonization that happen in this thing, in that moment, right? And so I think there are multiple Sivas in some ways for multiple people. And I think what I've been trying to do over the last kind of, I don't know, 3 or 4 years is retrieve a version of Siva that was very important in the debates in the 1980s and 90s around what anti-racism was, what its links were with anti-imperialism, the struggles in the third world, because that relationship between anti-racism, technology, and the global economy, that's come back as being, well, it never left, right? But in some ways, now everyone's like, oh, well, how do I, what does it mean to understand tariffs for racism, right? What does it mean to understand tech, microchip processors? Because the US is very unhappy that the Chinese may vault it in this technological race. What's that got to do with racialization? And some way that version of Siva, which we kind of maybe forgotten a bit about, has come back to kind of help us, I think, navigate this current moment.
Yeah, and that's so interesting, isn't it, John? Because in a way, it's interesting that he used the metaphor of circuits and circuitry, and in a what, and it was anticipate. Do you think there's part of the reason Siva, as you say, was many different things, but he somebody who moved between poetry and political economy with ease, who wrote short stories and novels as well as political essays and so on. I just wondered whether that's part of the singularity of him as a writer as well as a movement activist and
yeah, I think this is linked to the idea of what the Institute of Race Relations is and was, right? Wasn't is. It's supposed to. We still do this. Is that we're not part of the movement, but we're not in the academy.
Yeah.
We're like a kind of meeting. What Siva used to refer it as like I mean, probably can't do this with the green transition, but we used to be like the fuel station for the movement, right? Well, I guess we'd be like the solar power now for the movements. In a sense, it was that idea of we had time and resource to do research. We could do interventions, and movements who were fighting emergencies could come, pick that stuff up, run with it, and we could have a kind of dialectical relationship of knowledge exchange. And I think what's important here is I think actually all of the people in the series is they're not driven, and I guess we'll get to this when we talk about outputs and things like that. They weren't driven to either do their activism or produce intellectual work by the kind of strictures of a kind of economic wage labor relation, were they? They were driven by the nature of the movement demanding that we needed stuff here or there. And I always think there's a good example of this is the two most famous male anti-racist scholars of the 1980s are probably Siva, who's not really an academic, right, but sits outside, and then Stuart Hall.
Mm.
And apart from the book, which does the kind of reverse, and he actually erases the white scholars policing the crisis because there were white people who wrote that with Hall. Neither Hall or Siver really have a monograph. They have these intervention essays driven by the movement that they're trying to be part of and not lead, right? Like they're part of a movement. And I think that gives you a sense of why Siver spoke across multiple kind of formats, is that there were interventions linked to the movement and its different facets of a movement, because anti-racism isn't solely reducible just say to resistance on the streets. It has multiple facets to it. It is a way of life.
Mm. But it's true, isn't it, that it's also in relation to knowledge and learning, which isn't so tied to qualifications in a straightforward sense. It seems to me. I wanted to ask both Amelia and Hannah to talk about this in terms of archives of knowledge and resources for knowledge and learning. And I mean, I wondered how it. I think this is such a beautiful moment where these bridges across time of political commitments are being connected across time. But I wonder what it was like to try to engage with this earlier moment, really, which when I think back to it now was probably full of a sort of secret series of codes about who's allied to whom and so on. But yeah, I wonder if you could, each of you, perhaps Amelia first, to talk about what it was like to attend to that archive that needed to be assembled and tended and created in a way.
I mean, it's been a very interesting process. It's ongoing, because ever since Gerlin's book was published, all kinds of people have, emerged and given their testimonies and how they knew Gerlin, or they worked on a project with her, or they're, were a young person and she helped put them out of a police station or something like that. So I think for me, the most valuable resource has always been the community that was around Gerlin in different, spaces, because she lived in Brixton, back in Jamaica, and also in just outside of Harare in Zimbabwe as well. So she has these networks throughout the globe. Some people that I encountered during my research had no idea about this other aspect of her life. So they themselves, were discovering her just by participating in this project, which was really good. But I think oral history is the backbone of Gerlin's story, but also of this particular era of history. And as Hannah knows very well from her Black Culture Archives involvement, oral histories, and I think that series of oral histories that was conducted around the Black women's movement in Britain is one of the most well-used aspects of the BCA's collection. So that says a lot. But I think people, especially people like me, who I don't consider myself to be a traditional historian. I kind of I fell into it accidentally, and now I'm doing a PhD. But my interest was very much sparked by listening to stories of, my parents, grandparents, people around me who had this experience of having migrated from the Caribbean, and what that was like, and how it connects to my own experience of Britain today. And I think for a lot of other, not only young people, but people who come to history or sociology from a slightly different angle than just kind of like a narrow educational path, are very much interested in hearing about these stories in that way, as kind of conversations. I hope that answers it.
No, it did. I wondered, Hannah, if you could speak to that too, but also maybe the question of those who are celebrated and those who are less celebrated. But yeah, I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I'm trying to kind of assemble them from lots of things that have been said already. So I think that question of the archive, as I think I've said before, is really crucial to both my interest and kind of the work that Garrison was doing, which was, I think, maybe for those who were around in the 1980s, the very nature of stating that Black history or women's history or LGBTQ plus history is also history was in itself just a really radical thing to say. And so sometimes, at least I found I was kind of unaware, or kind of took me a really long time to really appreciate that, you know, coming kind of in a post 97 kind of Labour cultural diversity kind of thing, that actually just that, yeah, that kind of just a speech act of my history is important was something that was really radical and extremely pushed against in terms of the kind of mainstream heritage work. So the very kind of nature of kind of Len's focus on going around preserving and collecting materials was slightly confusing to a lot of heritage professionals, but also kind of the types of material he was collecting. So as Amelia was saying, oral histories, flyers, leaflets, things that are otherwise not normally seen within the kind of traditional, I mean, maybe less so now, but at the time, kind of traditional bounds of history. So for a long time, even the kind of the organization being able to call itself an archive within the heritage sector was a bit dubious. You know, even up until like the 2000s, we had kind of other institutions looking upon the collection as sort of like, but is this really archival? And I think this kind of links to something I've been thinking about in terms of what John was saying about Siva's interest in maybe technology, kind of the use of circuits. And I think both as an affordance, the availability of technology meant that these kind of archives could be created. But also I think there was, this is something that I'm trying to work through, a tacit understanding that the kind of racial logics of technologies are also very, very obvious to some people. And so kind of thinking as that kind of moves into digital technologies, what that kind of helps us to think about. But yeah, so basically, and then all that kind of feeds into then how histories are written, how people are remembered, the kind of always partiality of some of these stories in that, you know, again, Len Garrison, I was able to write more about him because not only was he collecting archives, but his own archive, again, partial, so there's lots of things I still don't know, was very readily accessible to me, as the archivist there too. Yeah, so kind of the kind of layering of, and I was kind of thinking about this when I was writing my PhD, that the narrative I'm writing about the Black Cultural Archives is only available through the material that is available at the Black Cultural Archives. So, you know, the kind of ability to move beyond that is slightly difficult, but at least it is a narrative, and it, you know, it's still possible because of the kinds of materials, which is then underpinned by, especially in the 70s and 80s, the relative accessibility of some of these devices and technologies that allowed people to record for themselves, maybe for the first time, which I think is a kind of a crucial part of some of these kind of some of our ability to do this work. And now we have other technologies that allow us to a degree to do this.
And you know, as you were talking, it made me think, you know, of Errol Lawrence's really important essay, you know, in the abundance of water, the fool is thirsty, quoting Bob Marley. You know, it's about attention as well as the archive, what the materials itself is. But I suppose that I wondered if you thought there was we're in a bit of an archival moment. It feels like that community archives, there are many rich ones. I was thinking also of the George Padmore Institute and the New Beacon Circle and John LaRose and so on in another part of London, where that's an incredibly rich archive of material in a sector which is where those archives probably aren't valued in the way that they should. I don't know if you think that's true.
Yeah, I think we are. And I think that one of the things that I am very aware of is because of the work of people like Garrison and Gerlin Bean and Siva in kind of making these statements and making these kind of arguments for recognition, that what I would call the mainstream heritage institutions are paying attention to and are collecting more, and there is just generally more diversity. One could argue about the extent to which that is potentially problematic, but we won't today. And so I think, you know,
We should talk about the problematic parts.
in terms of, you know, like whether that is truly people's intentions, but who knows? And I think, you know, they have made a real significant impact in the value and the collection of these materials. There was something else I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was.
No,
Make a question again, and hopefully it will come back to me.
it will come back, I'm sure. I mean, this is a
Oh, sorry. Yes, archival moment.
Oh,
Yes.
please.
Yes. So I think, yeah, and the number of people who are aware and interested in using archives. But I also think that we're actually in a moment of real archival danger too.
Archival
And
danger.
again, going back to uh, with my kind of role in the digital humanities department at KCL, the inherent fragility of the internet and digital culture means that whilst digital media, older digital media has a little bit more longevity than the kind of current digital media, that and the kind of some of the things that John was talking about in terms of platformization and who owns all these networks, that actually we're in more danger of our heritage and histories being completely lost, because if Mark Zuckerberg wakes up tomorrow and decides to turn Meta off, then oof, how many of us have printed off all of our pictures and our decades, for some of us, of conversation on, if you're on these platforms and things like that. So I think, whilst the attention is is much clearer and much better underpinned by the work of all these really key archives, we're actually in a space where we're also in a bit more fragility, and whether who's making the decisions and who has the money and who has the kind of power and authority to support these institutions to thinking through some of this stuff, that is still very asymmetrical.
I really like John and Amelia to address this too. John, you've mentioned a few times in passing that the notion of retrieval, and given the quality of our thinking together around the danger, possibility, and so on, I wonder, why do you use that phrase, retrieval?
Retrieval, because it's there, it existed. And I think that in some ways, look, we do this with, if we just go back to the idea of, like, at some point in human history, people that look like me weren't deemed capable of having thought, right? We weren't declared capable of having independent thought that rivaled the kind of Western knowledge structure. And part of what we realized also, and I think academics have been doing this, or hopefully they should do, is be a bit more humble and realize that communities, especially communities of resistance, right? Communities that resisted, say, state racism or the colonization, produced knowledge and produced thought that stands, I actually think, in much better standing than the knowledge that is taken to be about very important things like politics, the economy, and other things like that. That our communities weren't just, and that's just to say aren't just, I mean, it's one thing to stand against something, but they also produce something. Yeah, they were creative. They understood things. I mean, I used to do and still do research on British Black Power, and they had an understanding of what we're going to call neoliberal globalization and commodity change a long time before that became very popular in academic circles. And so retrieving that is a kind of is a thing we have to do. And then it's also about how and where we retrieve and who we're retrieving for. And that's a big question then about, what is the nature of that retrieval? Can we retrieve for different communities? Are we retrieving just for a very small subset that, and then we get the extractive idea. So you've retrieved, and I think retrieval is much better than extraction, because retrieval is bringing back something and not just taking something. And that raises questions of who we're bringing it back for, which I think we can have together.
No, I think that's such we hadn't scripted that, John, but that's a beautiful way to raise that question about audiences and responsibilities. And I wonder if, Amelia, I could ask you about, writing the book about Gerlin being, what kind of audiences were you hoping to address, and what kind of audiences were you hoping to reach through writing the book in the way that you have?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the key consideration when I was writing was really just to fill a massive void in the kind of in the written history, and ensure that people could get a sense of who Gerlin was, her politics, that underpinned everything that she did, and also just the expansive nature of her activism and what we can learn from that in our present context. So it was, I think the intention was for her story to be a kind of a blueprint for future activism as much as it is about trying to recover the past. And in that way, it was aimed at anyone who's interested in activism and helping to build positive futures in different aspects. And so I tried my best to keep it as non-academic as possible. But as you mentioned, I think at the beginning of this is a history that is covered in acronyms, and so that in itself is really inaccessible. And it's a criticism of myself that I didn't make it more apparent in the book when I'm speaking about the Brixton Black Women's Group. There's only so many times you can write out the full title or something before you just start using acronyms. But it does mean that for those who are arriving at this history without prior knowledge of the Black radical movement, it's like becomes a lesson as opposed to an easy read. It will never be an easy read, but it could have been easier.
Oh,
For all these acronyms. So it's something I think for me to take forward as I continue to work on Gerlin's story, because there's a lot more that should be documented about her, is how to make it break it down in a way that it reaches as many people as possible so that it's as useful as it can be.
Yes, no, we have some questions coming in from the audience, which I'll move to in a moment, if I may. But I wondered if I could ask you all about the stakes of this moment in the intervention, because sociology's history around this, and particularly of white sociology's history around this, was a deeply contested one in this moment, and I don't think we should shirk away from that. That what was at stake in these struggles around knowledge, who were knowledge makers, and as John was saying, and I wondered if that's something that you've thought about this as a kind of pivotal moment around the struggle over what knowledge could be and who could be the knowledge makers and theorists. I think in my mind at that moment, remembering it, there was a very hotly contested struggle over research theory, who could be a researcher, and so on, and also how open the communities had a very bad experience of being over researched. And I just wondered if we could speak a little bit about that, just in terms of what was at stake. I don't know, John, do you want to speak to that first?
Yeah, I can have a little go. I think the stakes of all of that were, to me, are always look, the stakes of the 1970s and the 1980s, which I think Siva is pivoting in, and in the 90s and even now, are still the same, some of the same stakes they were. They're ideas of liberation and freedom, and dare I say, revolution. And that, in a sense, that hasn't changed. But look, we're living in a moment. If you think about what are the stakes of who are knowledge bearers, who is it to make claims upon knowledge, then and then we bring in the tech side, as we've been experiencing over the last 2 years, we've been live streamed a genocide via our social media.
Indeed.
And in a sense, the stakes of that debate are still the stakes that are with us, right? So when our students tried to act like knowledge claimants against their universities and argued they should divest their institutions from the arms trade, the universities turned around and said, well, you're a bit naive, right? Your knowledge is not correct. And so those stakes of those debates of our movements are creating forms of knowledge where it's abolitionists around basically eradicating prisons and defunding the police. We're still seeing those same things play out. And I think, all of the characters here are part of that idea of our knowledge claims are, in a sense, just as valid as what the institution says to us when they deny our knowledge claims. And our communities are sites of knowledge creation for the current moment. And that I think is quite still pivotal from the 60s right through to now.
Yeah. I don't know if either Hannah or Amelia have had thoughts about that? I don't want to make you speak to sociology in a narrow sense, but
yeah, well, I mean,
the broader question would be.
caveating, I don't come from a sociological disciplinary background. So, but yeah, just to kind of echo what John was saying, that I think very, at least for Garrison and the others, very, very tuned to those stakes and the importance of using and creating material that can not only testify and capture knowledge and knowledge generation and what's happening and what's going on, but as I think as Amelia said, I think that as a blueprint. So Garrison, and you mentioned George Padmore Institute, people like John LaRose and the founders of the Huntley Archive, Eric and Jessica Huntley, they were extremely clear about their kind of publishing work, but also their archival work as a means to stop the blocking of knowledge from generation to generation from generation, particularly those coming from the history and the histories of the transatlantic slave trade, where families were deliberately dispersed, communities were deliberately destroyed, so that knowledge could not be transmitted. So those are the kind of key issues, and with education thrown into that. So the kind of key, very clear tension and issues that were at the forefront of the minds of at least the kind of organizations that I have been thinking about. Yeah, so to not only capture and preserve and kind of keep that knowledge safe, but also to make sure that, I think I think John Lewis used to say, not reinventing the wheel. So if you're a young activist, if you're kind of interested in thinking about, well, how do we fight this, that you can go to the archive and you can find out literally what did people do. And whilst, we're in different times and the kind of context might be slightly different, but just the idea of petitioning, the idea of picketing, the idea of some of these kind of actual practical tools of activism are there for people to kind of pick up and use and discard if necessary, but without having to think, oh, how do we do this? But also a way to John's point, essentially to also a way of like surfacing that this is not new. These are the same issues. These are the same. These are these are genealogies. These are continuations of the kind of work that people were doing before. Again, not to think that we're all having to start from scratch all the time.
Yeah, I know you've thought a lot about this, Amelia, too, in terms of this question around audiences' responsibilities. I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
I think that's an interesting question. I would say that there's not really a difference between audience and knowledge producer, because we're all capable of producing knowledge, and so that's the first place to start. Is that, and this is something that I kind of the collectives that I'm a part of are always trying to like drum in, is that we're not doing this work in order to kind of like hand it off and be like, here you are, enjoy this story or, this film or whatever it is. But it's about hopefully inspiring people to do the exact same and not being intimidated by lack of resources, because that's just a constant. None of us have the resources that we need to do what we want to do, but that shouldn't stop us from finding a creative means to do it, and also collaborating with other people who have that same vision. I think John and Hannah have both talked about the importance of having a sacred space, especially in the context of the Zuckerbergs and whoever else is of the world. But the Institute of Race Relations and the journal, that is a sacred space that people really want to protect, because we all understand how important it is to have something that is owned by the community and for the benefit. And that's the exact same with the Black Culture Archives, who's had various challenges, but has always had a kind of level of protection and admiration from Britain's Black communities. And I think that's with the way that we have to continue is thinking about how do we create our own physical and digital spaces that are protected by us for our own interests.
It's one of the questions that's come through in the chat, actually, Amelia, around the issue of design principles, really, for a kind of there's lots to learn from the legacy that you've described so eloquently, and I wondered if you had something maybe just quickly before we go on to our last questions. Sadly, it's gone past very quickly this hour. About that question of, well, what kind of what do you think should be recommended for building those kind of digital spaces, and how they might be linked to ones which are, places which can be visited with materials.
I mean, I'm not sure I can answer it because it's a question I'm pondering myself, and I haven't come up with a useful solution yet. We have various websites, and those are always at risk of being shut down at any point. But it is still important to have our own websites, even if they're not permanent. I mean, just to give you an example, I co-wrote a paper with Kelly Foster, who we all know very well. And that was published on the British Library website. And it's probably, like one of the best things that I've ever written. I don't know about Kelly, but it was because it was about all of these different Black feminist activists who were present in Britain at the time. And now there are other resources that have kind of come in its place. But as we know, the British Library had a massive cyber attack and they have not recovered in any way. So that means that's all disappeared. So the question of how we protect ourselves from these kinds of attacks, I don't have the knowledge to be able to address that, but it is an important question.
Well, I think it is actually, but as you know, we're on the cusp. That's the cusp of that challenge, I suppose, in so many ways. I wonder if we could come to a final theme, just briefly, and it's been such a wonderful thing to listen to you all, which is, the question, I suppose, of I would couch it as the kind of public life of the mind within this kind of situation of communities of resistance, as John was mentioning, quoting Siva. There's so much in the institutionalization of knowledge in academia about impact and outputs, and the metric qualities of what's measured and what counts and what's counted. I mean, I wonder if you had any reflections on what the three figures that we've been talking about have to teach us about a different sense of a relation to knowledge, learning, and understanding. What resources might they be for us to think about the pressures that are within academia, but also a public sense of a mission, I suppose, for our work? Very different style of. I suppose I'm trying to ask about what we might learn from their style of doing intellectual and political work.
I mean, I think one of the key things that keeps coming out is the idea of community and working with people, both in kind of in community, but also that kind of transmission and that kind of mentoring role. And to go to the kind of specificity of the university, that does not recognize or appreciate community work or working in partnership or in collaboration with people. So things like the ref, single author, like it still kind of continues that sense of idealization again of that kind of one person who does all of this work, even though that we know that's not, it's just not technically possible. And so I think the kind of the focus on recognizing and appreciating how we do things both in community as academics, all three of us here, but also in community with those who are not in the academic, but as you said earlier, but not in that kind of extractive way. So even things like, how do you pay people? Can you pay people? Where do you pay people? Do they have to go through 17,000 forms before they can take 7 years to get onto the systems? All those things, like all those kind of actual processes that make this life really hard. I think all those things just show that actual community work is not actually appreciated or valued. And so I think at least that's my kind of takeaway, is that if we could move away from the individualization and kind of really thinking about community generated knowledge and sharing.
John, I'm sure you've got thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a number of things when you write from, and I want to speak specifically about anti-racism, that I often get, I'm now old, you see, I'm now middle-aged, so I can't call myself young. Um, Younger scholars than me who turn up and they're bewildered by the institutional environment that they find in the academy, because in some ways their motivation for the work is slightly different to some of their colleagues. It's their biography or they're, that's driving what they got interested in. They have a relationship with it that isn't just a thing that they can park, write a journal article and park it there. And I always say to them, okay, well, you need to understand how you're slightly different, and then how does that impact how you work as an academic? Because that's actually partly why the work was sidelined so much. That's my take on it, because
Mhm.
it demands more. So it's not so easy to just, write your submission and do that. And so I think it's about understanding the difference of the academic production that your own politics is dictating in your own work, and then trying to manage the institutional fabric we had. And most of us will struggle with our institutional fabric in the university setting, right? We try to make it better. Some of us even did EDI at some point or things like that when universities were up for it. I don't know. But we did it in a way to manipulate the system towards that. Well, I did anyway, in a way that to bring it somewhere else. How can we use the university as a resource for our communities? But also, secondly, I think it's also about understanding that the demands of the academy are not always the demands of our community. So how we learn to speak, how we learn to transmit knowledge. This is why I think this project has been so great, because listen, lots of my friends who are interested in anti-racism were not academics. They have time to read. But they do have time to maybe listen on the way to work, in bits and things. So I think it's also thinking about the form and delivery. And part of that is understanding, I think, what anti-racism as scholarship, as knowledge creation is. And it's about our community. So just as we challenged who are the people who know the knowledge, I think we've got to also question the ways of how we disseminate the knowledge and get the knowledge out there.
Yes, thanks so much for that. Amelia, do you have any thoughts?
I certainly have thoughts, but
Of course you do.
I think no, I really agree with what Hannah and John have said, and it's interesting to see how we can use various different trends like TikTok to disseminate knowledge and stories. I know a few people, I guess my kind of age mates, are using TikTok in a really beautiful way as Black historians and sociologists, and doing such a good job of educating people. Just, as you're doom scrolling on your phone, suddenly you come across a video about Claudia Jones or Notting Hill Carnival or whatever. And I think that actually there is an appetite for it, even when people are not consciously Googling, but when it appears on your screen, all of a sudden you get this hunger to want to research into it yourself. So that's a really beautiful thing that's happening at the moment. And yeah, it's nice to watch.
That's a wonderful way. I mean, it's not really an ending, a pause maybe in this conversation. It's been such a delight to listen to you do talk about these issues, and please, I'd like to recommend our participants today to listen further and listen to your audio essays. You won't regret it. But I've got a few words of thanks and acknowledgement to say before we pause. First and foremost, thank you to the three of you. Thank you to John Narayan, A.S. Francis, and Hannah Ishmael for joining me today. Also, thanks to our producer, Alice Block, who's been quietly at the edges of the screen, keeping us to our focus and to task. Also to Sociological Review's Senior Events Officer, Danielle Galway, and Karen Schock, who's the Senior Comms Officer. I think the work that you do is incredible, and in the spirit of what John said, much needed. And also to those who are joining us at home today, we really appreciate your support for this event, particularly through donations. I mean, we're having to kind of operate in the sort of way that the activists of this moment have had to operate too, which is through raising money to do important work. Each one teach one, as a lesson that all rings in my mind. So thank you for that. After this, we'll be sharing an email with you all, which will feature the useful resources. They are brilliant resources for teaching, so look out for those. And just finally, I'd like to, before we sign off, just to say and to appeal to you really, please look out for and sign up for our newsletter. And if you could take a moment just to give us some feedback on the form that will be made available too, we'd really appreciate that. We're listening. We're trying to react and respond to the needs that are communicated to us. So if you could take a moment to do that, it isn't some kind of quantified process that's going to disappear. No, we're really just trying to respond to our audience and our community. And last, thanks for joining us this afternoon, and good luck, and have a nice rest of your afternoon. Thanks for joining.
Bye.